The following is an excerpt from a longer interview on Levinas with Dr. Aaron Simmons. Dr. Aaron Simmons is a leading scholar in the field of 19th, 20th century French phenomenology and existentialism, and it's a great privilege to have him on this channel.
What are his views on religion as a whole, and also his relationship with religion and Judaism?
So this question is way bigger than we have time to get into, and so I'll give you just a kind of bookends, maybe, and people can read my work or work of others who've done really good stuff on this. Jeff Koski did a really good book. So the idea is this: Levinas is Jewish. His particular take on Judaism plays out most explicitly in his Talmudic writings, Talmudic readings, these books that are basically essays engaging the Talmud and the lessons there, the way that makes sense. And he's trying basically in these works to go the opposite direction, right? So most of his work is taking Hebraic wisdom, translating it into Greek. And in these Talmudic writings, what he's effectively trying to do is unpack the Hebraic wisdom and make sense of it on its own terms without always the translation then into the kind of philosophical or phenomenological vernacular. But when it comes to religion, Levinas approaches the idea both of God and religion via his broader account of this moral framing. Now, he would say, no, I approach moral framing of the universe and ontology, rethinking these things because of understanding what was already there in these Hebraic ideas, right? So depending where you put the emphasis is kind of, which direction you want to travel in. But I would suggest that for most readers, the way to make sense of this is Levinas understands God as not a supreme being who is articulated with particular predicates that would be identified in a classical theistic way, such that God is omnipotent and omniscient and omnibenevolent and unchanging. And so we make sense of God as this like standard bearer for all that is human. Notice that kind of model, which of course many monotheistic Jewish thinkers articulate and hold and affirm. But that model for Levinas is troubling because it still locates God and being as this kind of, category by which we then are made sense of as similar or instantiated instances of this shared capacity with the divine. Instead, Levinas will say in a book, Of God Who Comes to Mind, which is a very strange title, but he basically says God emerges as, this is again a weird way to put it, but God emerges as the impetus or the sending toward the other, but it emerges only when the face of the other is visible. And so the way he'll put it is the trace, T-R-A-C-E, the trace of God shows up in the face of the other. So it's not that there's this relation to God that sends me to the other person, right? In a way that for Kierkegaard, I am commanded, thou shalt love the neighbor as yourself. God becomes the kind of great sending as this relationship by which the neighbor appears as a category. And that's why God is the middle term in all works of love for Kierkegaard. For Levinas, God is in some ways the afterthought, right? It's God comes to mind because this radical encounter with the other is first. And then we say, well, what does it mean to relate to the other in this way, in a way that holiness becomes possible? Well, now it seems like we're kind of talking in a religious domain. And so he'll use a lot of religiously framed words to animate what's going on in this philosophical account of ethics. Just a couple examples. He will say that ultimately, ethics is a kind of eschatological or spiritual optics. What does that mean? Well, it's basically, if I see the other via the lens of ethics, I am always seeing the other relative to the possibility of their flourishing. Well, at some level, isn't that what prophecy kind of means, right? Is that I'm living into what is possible, but is impossible without this kind of awareness of beyond, the awareness of more. And so that excessive, overflowing dimension is what Levinas will often use religious language to make sense of. So he talks about prophecy. He'll talk about eschatology. He'll talk about prayer as a kind of brokenness in relationship to the obligation of the other. So his way of making sense of religion, I would suggest, is, and again, I'm trying to catch this out in a kind of standard reading, but there's lots of debates and a lot of people who would then move in different directions. But maybe I can put it this way safely. Levinas's Judaism would be misunderstood if it is immediately positioned in terms of theism. God as another other is very much a question mark. And Levinas seems explicitly to reject that idea. God is not another other. God seems to show up as, again, this trace or depth on the backside of the other's signification. And I know that sounds weird, and I'm actually struggling to not make it even more abstract because this is where Levinas gets, I think, the hardest, because he's trying so hard, in my opinion, not to fall just into theology, which I think he successfully avoids doing. But he's not scared of this deeply religious language. Holiness, he says, has been my theme from the beginning, right? And these ideas get picked up, of course, in Derrida, who will then talk about messianism, and talk about these different ways of making sense of religion without religion. That idea, I actually think, is anchored in a very particular Levinasian understanding.